Where does your water come from? Some areas get their water from streams and lakes. Others get it from wells that are placed down into underground lakes called aquifers. However, these sources have their limits. In fact, water is a finite resource. While the surface of Earth is 70% water, only 2.5% of that is fresh water, and only 1% is available for our use. With only a limited amount of fresh water available, what happens when there isn't enough rainfall? A drought is such a period. Streams and lakes dry up. Wells stop bringing up water because the underground lakes aren't being replenished. The effects caused by a lack of water are many. First off, the environment is seriously affected.
Essentially what happens is during a drought, when there isn't enough water, many components of the environment really suffer. And so some examples would be trees they just don't have enough water, so we see a lot of tree deaths. We see a lot of wildfire impacts, forest fires. In terms of actual water, we see reductions in both surface water, so the amount of water that's flowing in a stream, which ultimately has a lot of impacts on both the water temperature, and in terms of species, can have very severe impacts on species. And then in terms of groundwater impacts that we see during a drought, often agencies who aren't able to access surface water in the allocations that they typically get will rely on groundwater as a backup source. And so we'll see huge declines in groundwater aquifers during droughts, which can result in land subsidence, reductions in surface water, impacts or losses of domestic wells, reductions in groundwater dependent ecosystems. So they're really severe droughts. And then ultimately we'll get some precipitation and the drought will be sort of declared over. But typically that is sort of a short-term respite. And so for the environment, it takes a long time for that recovery to actually occur. And so what that means is that we can still have prolonged periods where trees are still under stress and where groundwater aquifers haven't fully recovered.
An aquifer is basically an underground river, and a lot of people think, oh, we just have a big river or a big lake underground, and that's really not what an aquifer is. An aquifer, yes, are big bodies of water in areas underground. Unfortunately, it's not just a big lake. It's mixed in with tiny particles. The percolation rate, it allows the water to go from the surface down into the ground and collect in these big pond areas. It basically is just water filling in between the cracks. It's not a small little pond like you would think. It's, it can be 100 miles or 50 miles, depending on the size of that aquifer, depending on the type of material that's in the ground, depending on how much water is, how much rain is received in that area that year.
Yeah, so here in California, groundwater aquifers are particularly important because we tend to receive precipitation throughout the winter and then have long periods during the summer where we don't get any precipitation. So what tends to occur is we really rely on groundwater aquifers to provide water during those critically dry periods, either during the summer as a source of water for agriculture and for cities and towns. And during prolonged periods of drought, these large underground aquifers provide water over these long periods of drought. So I think one of the challenges in both thinking about groundwater and regulating groundwater is that you can't see it. And so it's often out of sight and out of mind. And so one of the linkages that is particularly obvious that we see when we overdraft groundwater aquifers is subsidence of the land. And so if you pump too much water out of a groundwater aquifer, it can actually, that decrease in pressure within the internal pressure within a groundwater aquifer can cause the land surface to actually drop. And so during this most recent drought, we saw portions of the California Central Valley actually sinking by several feet over the course of a single year. And there are two types of subsidence. The first is elastic and the second is inelastic. Elastic subsidence occurs on sort of a seasonal basis, and it can recover through time. But when you have very severe groundwater overdraft, what ends up happening is there's compression of the clay layers in that aquifer, and that subsidence that occurs is referred to as inelastic and is not recoverable. And so it leads to, number one, a reduction in the total groundwater available in the aquifer, and ultimately results in decreases in land elevation that cannot be recovered.
Aquifer is really kind of like a sponge, if you think of it that way. If you put your hand on a wet sponge and squish out all that water out of the sponge, and then take a glass of water and pour that glass of water on your hand, that's pushing down on that sponge. That water can't work its way back into the sponge because you're having that compaction happening.
Groundwater needed to be protected, that even though you couldn't see the water under the ground, it was being relied on in times of drought by farmers and others as a water supply. And the water table was being depleted. I believe it was 2.5 feet below where it was before. Well, if you keep on putting the straw in and sucking water out, eventually you'll run out. And if there's groundwater that's contaminated, then it's not usable.
Groundwater accounts for about 40% of the state's water supply on an average year. It's a huge amount, and it's something that most Californians don't know. That percentage increases substantially during drought periods. So that number will increase to upwards of to above 60% during dry periods of time. So during the most recent drought, groundwater accounted for more than 60% of the state's total water supply. And so it's really important that people understand, again, where their water is coming from and the impact of our water use on both the environment as well as the state's infrastructure system.
Sometimes we just say there's one water, and that's because water cycles through our planet. There's a big kind of global water cycle that we all are 100% reliant on functioning. And that's, very simply, it's just the precipitation that comes from the atmosphere. It soaks into our planet, into our Earth. We use it in lots of different ways. And then when we're done with it, it runs off, and then it goes out into the ocean, and that becomes this big pool that just evaporates out and goes into the atmosphere. And so all these water molecules have a chance to mix and integrate, and especially in our oceans, everything is kind of getting mixed together. And so anything that kind of runs off the land with the water will end up influencing the bigger pool of water that exists in our oceans. And some of that will just sit in the ocean and won't be able to evaporate out. But it does affect the big supply that we have in our oceans of water.
The first initial reaction that I get is, why? We're out of a drought. And that is not the right approach to have here in California when you're talking about water. We live in a Mediterranean climate. These types of droughts, these things happen here in California. We very possibly could have a drought next year or the year after that, or go into a drought this coming year, or for 5 more years.
California is a semi-arid state, and as a result, we really need to be careful. The snowpack for many years just wasn't there. It's a cycle. Water falls as rain, it's captured, and then it comes off. The snowmelt becomes our water supply. When there is no snowpack, then there isn't enough water for everybody. So we've been very fortunate this last year, but the message continues that even though we had a very good winter, it by no means filled all of our reservoirs and covered our depleted resource.
You care about results in 2 dimensions. One is, in the short run, you'd like to see something. But what we really care about from a conservation perspective is long run reductions. So as we all know that in the past spring, we had a lot of water come about, and maybe we're not in a drought anymore. But if you look at California's history and you understand the landscape and the climate it's quite likely that we're going to be back in a drought very soon. And the question is, are you going to have to start the process all over again in terms of giving people messages to engage in conservation? Or are the things that we did this time permanent enough that they actually lead to long-run water reductions that persist even after, say, a drought is gone?
Here in California, we basically have enough water in a typical year. And so by that I mean we have enough water to sort of meet the needs of the environment, municipal demands, and agricultural demands. But that typically requires some degree of groundwater decline associated with it. So even during typical years, we see groundwater aquifers, or the levels in groundwater aquifers, declining even in typical years. And so what we've really been trying to advocate for is conservation in all years, and taking that additional water that's been conserved and actually putting it into groundwater aquifers to allow to basically minimize the amount of decline that's occurring, and allow us to actually get them to help them recover during years where we actually have excess water. And so it is important that we conserve water in all years, just to be able to sort of balance the water budget that we have.
We could have a drought next year, and the idea of we have it now, let's waste it, is not the right approach to have if we want to keep this earth healthy, if we want to keep people being able to drink water, have safe, healthy drinking water. Then we really need to continue to conserve and do those conservation efforts, even though we had the wettest year on history and we have, you know, a full reservoir, you know, here and a full reservoir there. That really doesn't mean let's go back to wasting it. That's not the right approach. The right approach is we have it, let's conserve it. That's the right approach. Let's make what we have last as long as we can, not let's see how much water we can waste because we have it.
So I think probably my biggest concern related to water is how disconnected we are from it. And so when I say that, what I mean is we often go to a tap, we turn it on, and we expect that there's always high quality, unlimited water that comes out of it. And I think what the one sort of upside to the severity of the most recent drought that we've had here in California is it's really brought water to the forefront of people's attention. And so it's made them think about where does their water come from and the value of that water to them. And so I think the biggest thing that we can do on sort of a local scale is to really try to understand, number one, where your water comes from, and then really start to think about the value of that water and the amount of work that goes into making that water available to you, both you know, in terms of delivering it to you or conveying it to your house, treating it to make sure that it's safe to drink, and ultimately that there's a cost associated with that. So some portion of the environment is suffering by you having that water. And so by conserving that water and limiting your own usage, you're making that water available for its original intended purpose, which is, you know, flowing in streams or recharging groundwater aquifers.
Anytime you turn on the lights, anytime that you're using electricity, you're actually using water too. And that's because a lot of electricity that we have requires water in order to create that electricity. It's through the dams that we have in California that we've created to generate electricity. And then vice versa, all the water that we're using takes a lot of energy for us to be able to use it, to get it to our homes. And a big example of that is the water project that moves water from Northern California to Southern California. Uses a ton of energy, as well as, you know, even here in Napa, we have reservoirs, but we're also getting water from our delta, which is downhill of us. So we're using energy to pump that water into our homes here in Napa. So if you're interested in energy conservation, you should also think about water conservation. And if you're interested in water conservation, you should also think about energy conservation.
Desalination is very energy intensive and very costly and can have pretty severe environmental impacts. That being said, in some locations it can make sense to supplement sort of their local water supply, but as a statewide solution, it's not particularly viable.
You can't make new water, not effectively, efficiently, cheaply. There are mechanisms in place to try and do desalination. There are rules and regulations about how that's done. It's gotten a little cheaper, but still, we are faced with a finite resource of water, and we have to protect what little we have, whether it's in the groundwaters, in the aquifers, surface water protection. It all is vital for life.
Why wouldn't you want to conserve water? It's a precious resource, and it's finite, and every day, as the world gets to have more and more people, there's more demand on using water, and so we have to be more thoughtful. In times past, we didn't have to think so much about it being a limited resource, but now we have to be more careful and more forward-thinking.
It's important to conserve our use of fresh water, in particular, all the time, because we really have a very small amount of fresh water on this planet. With respect to the amount of water on the planet, and also with respect to the number of people on this planet that are completely reliant on fresh water. And so I think it's really important for each of us to try to use as little as we can so that we can preserve that for future generations.
Out of all the water on Earth, 97% of it is salt water. That leaves us with 3% water. Out of that 3%, 2% of that is locked up in ice caps and locked up in the ground and other places that we can't get. So that only leaves us with 1% of water. And out of that 1% of water, a lot of that, well, some of that is locked up in other areas that we can't use. So it really leaves us with about 0.01% of fresh water on Earth that we can use. So it's very, very important to conserve water, not pollute it, do the best you can with it, because it is the only natural resource that we have that we cannot live without. You can go without food for several weeks. You can only go without water for a couple days. And in some places in the world, a couple hours.
There are many countries that just don't have water, and they've learned to conserve. We can too.
Most of your water use goes to your outdoor. More than half your year's water goes to your irrigation. The best way to save water, in my personal opinion, is remove your lawn. Here in California, lots of people have lawns. Unfortunately, lawns are not conducive to our weather, our water storage, our soil. Nothing here in California really says grow a lawn. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people have done. That's why we have to store these giant bodies of water, these reservoirs, so that we have a water supply for people so that they can irrigate from, April to October, November, so that they can have these really nice, lush green lawns. To me, taking out your lawn is one of the most efficient ways to reduce your outdoor water consumption.
Like me, there were many consumers out there in the market who didn't understand where their water use or water waste was actually coming from. When you have a meter at your home, you can see how much water your home uses, but you don't really know how much is being consumed outdoors versus indoors. And in working with a water agency down in Southern California, we developed an advertising campaign with them to help make consumers more aware of how much water is indoor versus outdoors. So an example, one of the campaigns that they helped us develop was basically just a simple display ad on Facebook, which would send a message out to consumers telling them that if you ran your sprinklers for 15 minutes, that was the equivalent of running your shower for 7 hours. And most people don't realize this. And when we ran surveys to see how people were consuming water, people were going to drastic measures to really help out. But a really drastic measure indoor does very little relative to a very minor measure outdoor. So for instance, people might put a bucket underneath their shower to catch the water while they're waiting for the hot water to come into the shower. That saves a bucket of water. But if they're willing to take their sprinklers and move it back, say, from 15 minutes to 10 minutes, that saves a tremendous amount of water, which will allow them to take, hour-long plus showers. Every customer is different in terms of what they want or what they need, and so there's different solutions for different people. And so for some people who say may love gardening, converting to a drip irrigation system might be the best way to kind of carefully use your water but be able to maintain your vegetables and flowers and things you would like. Other people have been very successful at, say, using a rain barrel, which captures water that might be coming down when we actually are fortunate enough to have some rain here. And so what we have here is a list of different ways of conserving water. One is you could let your lawn go brown. One is you could remove your turf. Another one is that you could do the drip irrigation, you could do the rain barrel, or you could do the smart controller. And the fascinating thing that you see is that there's a lot of people who did each of these different alternatives. And in every case, people were able to reduce their water substantially. And I think it speaks to that point that there's a different solution for different people. Some people were able to find that water reduction by having a brown lawn, some people by drip irrigation, and some people by a smart controller. And so I think the most important message is to understand your needs and your wants and find a solution that actually works for you in terms of doing what you can to conserve water. And there's really so many solutions out there, there's probably something that's going to fit for everybody.
Don't run the dishwasher with a half full load. Turn off the water while you're brushing your teeth. Don't leave it running while you're washing your hands and you're lathering up, things like that.
So thinking about like how long we're running the tap when we're brushing our teeth, when we're taking showers.
Make sure your dishwasher is full or your clothes washer is full before you do a load, or maybe put a bucket in your shower and capture that water and go water the garden with it or something.
When you brush your teeth, don't leave the water running if the phone rings.
Thinking about what's happening to that water that we run while we're waiting for the shower water to get warm.
Make sure your toilet's not leaking. Check your toilet yearly.
Get involved.
We can really think about these machines that we put into our house, like our washing machine, our dishwasher, and we can make sure that those machines are running very efficiently.
Read the newspaper, stay in touch with your legislators, learn about the issues as much as possible.
Saving water while you're warming up the shower, catching that water to water your plants, things like that. Rainwater harvesting, all of those things are going to help you offset your outdoor use or help you conserve water.
Did you have anything else that you think might be? Our amount of water is limited, and the only way to protect the world and all its inhabitants is to conserve this precious resource. Water is essential for life, and we need to start treating it with the respect it deserves and have every drop count.